Let's begin in verse 40. Please follow along and let us hear together the word of the Lord. Luke 8, beginning at verse 40. And as Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official, a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he began to plead with him. He implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. They almost crushed him. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, constant bleeding for 12 years, could not be healed by anyone, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are surrounding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I knew that power had gone out of me." And when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately, instantly healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is the word of the Lord. The Gerasenes had just told Jesus to leave. Get out of our region. And in contrast to that, as we come into these verses, Jesus is being welcomed. Jesus is being happily received on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, we could call this passage an interruption passage. Jairus, who is the ruler of the synagogue, has come because his 12-year-old daughter is in critical shape. She is in a desperate situation. She is dying. And as Jesus is heading to the rescue, we have another desperate situation show up in this woman and her sickness. Now, I read a quote about desperation some years ago by the Presbyterian writer William Plumer. He said that bold enterprises or bold endeavors and a holy life, a godly life, have no worse foe than despair. He wrote, "Despair is the perfection of unbelief." We have two despairing situations here in Jairus and in this woman. Desperation will drive you to look under every single rock, hoping to find just a little bit of hope. Desperation will make you compromise things you never would have done. Break trust that had been long-standing and even thought impossible to break. Desperation will begin to suffocate your very spirit. Desperation will make you aggressively scroll for days on the internet, hoping to find the answer, and make you empty your bank account, hoping to find true happiness, even just a glimpse of it. The flickering flame of hope is quickly extinguished by bouts of despair that come into our souls. Despair has an icy grip that can make mountains of obstacles that seem impossible to overcome inside of us. And despair often leaves a hollow shell of where life once flourished inside of you and me. Friends, Jairus and this woman are both very desperate, but they could not be more different. I want you to notice that. Jairus is successful. Jairus is respected. He is the ruler of the synagogue. And yet, this woman, we're going to see in a moment, would not even be allowed to set foot in a synagogue. This man had 12 years of joy, laughter, love with his dying daughter. And this woman has known nothing the last 12 years but unrelenting agony and pain and despair and suffering. I mention this just to say that desperation does not discriminate. And there may be despair in many hearts this morning on these two polar opposite spectrums, and that doesn't mean either one is less real or less a battle. Today, we consider desperation to deliverance. We see a woman who becomes an outcast to a daughter, and then when we come back to Luke later, we'll finish up looking at Jairus' situation. So really just 3 points today. First off, I want us to make clear we understand why she was desperate. Let's look at the disease this woman faced. So Jairus comes pleading with Jesus for help. And it's interesting in verse 42, it says that the crowds are pressing against Jesus. They're stifling him, inhibiting him, almost crushing him to get from where he is to Jairus' home and Jairus' daughter. This is a traffic jam. This is like an ambulance trying to get to someone who is dying, and everyone is getting in the way with heavy traffic. Now, you can imagine how upsetting this would be to Jairus. All he knows is his daughter is dying, and Jesus is his only hope, and these crowds are getting in the way. There's so many people around, it might feel hard to breathe at this moment as this is taking place. Now, at this point, Luke interjects a story within a story. The rush to Jairus' daughter is interrupted by this anonymous woman. And I want to stop here for a minute because I think it's important for us to recognize that people are not interruptions, though sometimes they feel like interruptions. Text messages, knocks on the door, somewhat annoying conversations should not always be hastily considered nuisances, bothers. They should not be considered distractions to our lives. You know, when I read this here, I see Jesus showing us that Christians are in the people business. And that people are not an interruption to the work and calling God has given us. People are the work that God has called us to. Even when there are very pressing moments like Jairus' situation, people are not the problem. People are opportunities. And when this woman comes to Jesus, she is a golden opportunity, not an interruption to the plan of God. Some of us are way too busy to pay attention to the people that are constantly popping into our lives, which may very well be the mission field we're supposed to be spending our time with. So, this woman shows up. She's had a hemorrhage for 12 years, my translation says. Others say a flow of blood, a discharge of blood. She was subject to bleeding. She suffered with constant bleeding. We don't know exactly what's going on here. Probably uterine hemorrhaging, a tumor, a disease in the uterus. This is not a regular menstrual cycle issue at all. This woman has a constant and excessive internal blood problem with no intermission, meaning she never feels strong. She never feels healthy. She never feels well. She has hormonal battles. She is chronically ill. And don't miss that here. Chronic illness is an uninvited guest in the body of everyone who deals with it. Chronic illness sticks around for seasons, for years, sometimes for lifetimes, reshaping the way the body functions, leaving someone sick, downcast, discouraged, isolated, alone, sometimes feeling very broken and even angry. I read these words some years ago, and I think they well describe the battle that many people face, like this woman. One modern writer says, sometimes our monsters are invisible. Sometimes demons attack you from the inside. Just because you cannot see the claws and the teeth does not mean they aren't ripping through me. Pain does not need to be seen to be felt. There are many of us who can really appreciate these words because of chronic suffering we endure. And by the way, the church, even our church, yes, needs to do better at paying attention to those who are chronically ill and sick. I want to remind us today that because someone is chronically ill or sick does not mean that they are under the judgment of God, does not mean that God does not love them, does not mean that they are not important to the plan of God. One of my favorite underestimated passages in the New Testament is in John chapter 11, where Lazarus is dying and then he dies, and the messengers come to Jesus, and 2 times they say, Lord, he whom you love is sick. He whom you love has died. Lazarus' sickness was not because God did not love him, God did not care about him, Jesus' heart was not for him. Chronic illness does not mean God is angry with you. It does not mean that you are unimportant to the kingdom of God. Suffering and sickness is no sign of God's anger or wrath at all. In fact, the opposite is true in John 11. The one you love is sick. Or in John 9, the man blind was blind from birth, not because he sinned or because his parents sinned, but for the glory of God. If you're chronically ill, whether it is physical ailments that are very publicly seen, or you privately suffer, it does not mean that God is angry with you or has abandoned you or has forgotten you at all. Now, this woman's sickness of 12 years is physically bad, but we haven't even talked about the social and religious issues involved in her sickness. The Old Testament law spoke to her condition. This would have alienated her from society. Leviticus 15 talks about a woman with a discharge of blood for many days, not simply her menstrual cycle. And if she has this discharge beyond that, all the days of her unclean discharge, she will continue as though in her menstrual impurity. Any bed on which she lies on all the days of her discharge shall be her, like her bed at her menstruation. Everything which she sits shall be unclean, like her uncleanness from her impurity. Whoever touches anything shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. I know this is an uncomfortable text in the Bible, and many congregations probably wouldn't even address this on a Sunday morning. Sometimes the Bible makes us feel uncomfortable because the world is not Disney World, all right? That's an imaginary world. Real people really suffer. And sometimes these things make us uncomfortable to deal with. So, if anyone were to touch this woman's clothing or sit down on a chair that she sat down on, they would have been considered ceremonially unclean and defiled. This is a stigmata, a shame that she had to deal with. By the way, people were still stupid, judgmental idiots in Jesus' day, just like they are today. Is that good? Godly adjectives for you? Rabbis would have accused her of maybe she was an immoral woman. That's why she's suffering like this. They would have told her she was excommunicated from the synagogue for having this physical ailment, and maybe even encouraged her husband, if she was married, to divorce her because she was not cured. Friends, one writer has said, she would have been like walking pollution in the first century Judaism, rabbinic Judaism of her day. This type of sickness is often used, even in God's law and His Word, as a metaphor for the depths of sin. You've got to understand how socially awkward and hard this would have been in an era without our modern medicines and chemical answers. In Ezekiel 36, we see there, Son of man, when the house of Israel was living in their own land, they defiled it by their ways and their deeds. Their way before me was like the uncleanness of a woman in her impurity. Don't miss this. Socially ostracized, spiritually looked down upon by hypocrites who were ignorant spiritual lightweights, judgmental people. This woman, for 12 years, knew nothing but shame. She was truly an outcast in her world. Mark's gospel details something else not mentioned by Luke, and that is what she had done the last 12 years trying to get healed. Notice in verse 26, she endured much at the hand of the doctors and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all. Instead, she had only got worse. So what this means is that a private medical savings fund and health insurance would not have been enough to get her well. Of course, they didn't even exist then. There was no state-funded medical aid. In the ancient world, good health was a precious commodity, and a doctor's visit was only for the wealthy. And she had burned up all her resources, going to many different doctors, and her case was considered hopeless. Now remember, Luke, who's writing the Gospel of Luke, was in fact a medical doctor. Colossians 4 tells us that. And yet he is saying here, just as Mark says, her case was incurable. No one was able to help her. In fact, the doctor's treatments for this sickness in that day and age were simply ridiculous and embarrassing. The Jewish Talmud prescribed 11 different cures, which were nothing but superstitious foolishness. One of them was carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag in the summer and a cotton bag during the winter around with you. Now, where do you get one of these eggs in the Mediterranean? That's beside me. Another involved carrying around a barley kernel that had been found in the dung of a white female donkey. This is outrageous. Sometimes they would concoct these vile-tasting mixtures. One remedy consisted of drinking a goblet of wine containing a powder compounded from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses that probably tasted like somebody's kombucha formula, or maybe a bunch of essential oils mixed together in a potion, a water health healing mixture. Another treatment consisted of a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine and administered with the statement, "Arise out of your flow of blood." In other words, they didn't know what they were doing. There was no hope. She had went to every doctor she could find. She had had every blood test, every MRI, CT scan, and they were just as clueless as when it all started as to why she suffered. She could not be healed by anyone. No hope for her. Social outcast. She feels lost and alone. That's her disease. Pretty bad. But I want you to see, secondly, her determination. Look with me at verses 44 to 46. It says there, she came up behind Jesus, and she touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, Master, the crowds are surrounding and pressing in on you. But Jesus said, someone did touch me, for I knew the power had gone out of me. Again, Mark gives one more detail. Luke does not. Mark tells us that internally what the woman was thinking was this. She said, if I just touch Jesus' garments, I will be saved from this. Notice she is not going to touch Jesus' person. Remember the Leviticus law. She will not touch his person. I just need to touch his clothing. If I can just get to the border of his clothing. She looks at Jesus and she sees a fountain of mercy. She knows there's hope in Jesus. And if I can just get that close. So what does she do? It says she comes up behind him. I want you to pay close attention to this. She's ashamed to come in front of him. She is ashamed to personally speak to Jesus one-on-one. She is humiliated by her illness. She is an outcast. She doesn't want to be noticed by anybody. Hold on a minute. That could be some of us today. How many of us come to church on Sunday and we don't want to be noticed? I've had people tell me over the years, I really love your church. It's very friendly. In fact, it's so friendly, I feel uncomfortable sometimes because I really like bigger churches where I can go in and go out and not be noticed by anyone and not have anyone talk to me. We can laugh at that, but I think whether you're in a big church or a small church, some of us feel that way a lot. We would rather just not be noticed. And so she comes up behind him, and she doesn't want the religious hypocrites to catch her because they'd be very angry for her even being in the crowd because they would go way above and beyond the law. And all she wants to do is simply touch the fringe of his garment. Now, in the Hebrew language, that's called the zithith. All right? We read in Numbers 15 that God had commanded the Jewish men, the Israeli men, to wear on the corners of their garments tassels of blue, would remind them when they looked on them of the law of God, that they were to keep the law of God. These cords were to be a symbol of purity, of holiness. And it's interesting to me that this woman who is impure thinks, if I can just touch one of the cords of his clothing, I will be made clean. That's how pure she sees Jesus. And what's so beautiful here is she touches him from behind just the cords, and immediately the source of her bleeding is healed. In one brief second, 12 years of suffering is gone. Health, vigor, life begin to surge in her body. She is never again troubled like this. Think of what we have considered so far in this series. The wind, the waves, the sea obey Jesus' word. A demon-possessed man who could be controlled by nobody is set free by Jesus' word. And now a sickness that no physician could cure is removed by Jesus Christ. This woman had been desperate for so many years, bouncing from doctor to doctor, losing her entire bank account, draining it all, totally alone. She hears about a man who forgives sins without money and without price. He does this. He doesn't charge anything. And she hears, if I can only come to him by faith, he'll change me. And Jesus, as the great high priest, unlike the old priests, who all they could do is simply pronounce someone clean, when she touches Jesus' garment, she doesn't make Jesus unclean. He makes her whole. You see, when we come to Jesus with our sin and lay it upon him, that doesn't make him a sinner. It makes us clean and makes us saints. When you read this here, it is truly beautiful. But the next words startle the woman. Her great faith is immediately shooken up because Jesus says, "Who touched me?" This is kind of like if you're one of the people who have come to church and you don't want to be spotted by anyone, and one of the greeters snag you at the door as you were trying to get through that hole. That, you timed out your entry just right that no one was standing there, and then someone just pops up at that moment. Or in the old days, before COVID, we used to have the shake the hand time. You remember that good old time? Every introvert's worst nightmare. And you were just trying to hide in the corner, and someone got to you. At that moment, this woman who had been trying to hide and not be seen hears Jesus not say, "Who brushed into me?" "Who bumped into me accidentally with no purpose?" "Who touched me?" Now listen, back to Jairus for a minute. We're going to really get into him when we come back to Luke 8. Jairus must have been very upset that Jesus stopped the train again to ask this question. Precious time is being wasted, and my daughter is dying. In fact, this interruption is going to cost his daughter her life. And you're asking, "Who touched me?" And then Peter, he's such a genius. Notice what he says, "Master, the crowds are surrounding and pressing into you, crushing into you." Peter is trying to correct Jesus again. "How can you ask this, Jesus?" He's basically saying to Jesus, "Duh." We are also like Peter, aren't we? We like to talk to God, but just in advisory capacities. Not in prayer, in trust, in the learning posture, in the discipleship posture. Now, I think there's a secondary application here I don't want to miss. The church father Augustine, when he was preaching on this passage, he said, multitudes still come similarly close to Jesus Christ in the means of grace, but all to no purpose, being only sucked into the crowd. In other words, you can come to church week after week. You can bump into Jesus. That's not the same as reaching out and touching him in faith. Too many people, they carelessly bump into Jesus. They're invited to church. They walk in the doors. They hear his word. They're around his followers and his family. They recklessly take a communion meal. They may even quickly put money in the plate. They may put money in the box or give online. But how few really come to Jesus and reach out to him and really pray and really meditate on what they think and hear and really remember the cross. And they can see him dying, and they can see his blood poured out, and they see him rise from the grave, and they feel his personal love for them. And how many really have Jesus' love in them and love others? All too often, we evaluate a successful Sunday by, did the music go well? Were the pews full? Was there good humor? Did I get something out of the service? And we go home. But I would suggest to you, the scorecard should be, did we really reach out and touch Jesus? Did we really encounter Christ? The church father Augustine said, our flesh presses, but it's only faith that touches. I ask you, church family, today, have you had that touch? Filling the church is not the same as coming to Jesus Christ. Don't be so close and not come. Now, there's a second encouragement here I don't want you to miss, and it's in a positive one, and that is that many poor, desperate, outcast, broken people come to church, come to Jesus. They are healed, they are helped, they are saved, and yet they're lost in a crowd, and nobody seems to take notice of them but Jesus. Just because no one else knows your name doesn't mean Jesus doesn't know your name. Just because you're hurting today and you haven't joined the church yet and no one has celebrated what God's done in your life doesn't mean God hasn't done something in your life. I read this today, and I want to encourage you in that point. All right, verse 46. Jesus said, "Who touched me?" For he knew the healing power had gone out of him. Now, I do not believe Jesus is at all ignorant of what has just happened here. I want to point that out. I don't think this woman walked up and touched Jesus and she was healed, and then he realized what happened, as if it took him or startled him or threw him off or surprised him or something like that. Not at all. This question here is absolutely no different than God saying, "Adam, where are you?" Adam, where are you? He knew exactly where Adam was. But he is calling the woman forward. Jesus has plans for this desperate woman who has been delivered. He is not going to leave her an outcast. So he needs to call her. Jesus says this, and he says, "I knew." Knowledge by personal experience. He doesn't do this to embarrass her. What Jesus did privately in healing this woman, he now tells this woman to declare publicly. A few reasons why. Number one, this could be a consolation to Jairus, who is probably having a bit of a holy heart attack right now as Jesus has been stopped from getting to his daughter. What is about to be seen here could be a comfort to Jairus' heart. God is still in control when there is delay in your prayers being answered. God's still in control. He's still working. He's not done. It's not over yet. Secondly, imagine this woman is healed, right? But she would still be a social and religious outcast for probably a very long time before people might believe that her life has changed after 12 years of suffering this way. And Jesus wants her to be able to get access back to the temple today. Jesus wants her to be able to go see her family today. Jesus wants her to go visit someone's house and actually sit in the chair today. Jesus wants her to be able to have joy today. And so she needs to be publicly proclaimed whole. Jesus also wants her to know her faith made her well. And he wants all of us to know there was nothing magical about his garment. It wasn't the fabric that healed her. It wasn't the tassel that saved her. You don't need holy relics to get to heaven. Pilgrimages to so-called holy sites save nobody. Why? Because the only holy sites in the world are the hearts of followers of Jesus Christ. The Holy Land is everywhere a Christian is. All the earth is the Lord's. And it is those who are saved who are holy. And so don't go pilgrimage somewhere thinking that will make you more spiritual. No, go to Christ to find life. By the way, she came secretly, quietly, embarrassed, ashamed, didn't have the courage to interrupt Jesus, didn't feel like she deserved his audience. And what I love here is Jesus stops the multitude on the great way to do this miracle, and he gives all of their attention to this poor, humble woman. And he reminds us, you think nobody cares about you? You think you're an outcast and alone? God cares about the supposed smallest person in the world. Isaiah 57 says it this way: "Thus says the Holy One, high and lifted up, who dwells forever. I dwell on a high and holy place." God's in heaven. God rules and reigns over the world, but also with the crushed, the lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly, to revive the heart of the crushed. Oh, if you're humble, he'll be with you. He'll lift you up. He'll revive you. He cares about that person in hiding. By the way, he also wants a public confession of faith. Faith concealed must become faith revealed. In other words, in the process of discipleship, you don't stay secretly saved. It starts in your heart invisibly, but it becomes visible. You confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus. You call on the name of the Lord to be saved. I would suggest to you that some of us need to start opening our mouths a little more to let others know that we believe in Jesus and He has saved us. His purpose was not to embarrass her, it was to bless her and use her. A woman who felt like 12 years her life had been wasted, now her testimony is going to be used in this crowd, and it will be used for the rest of the history of the world as a witness to the saving power of Jesus Christ. So we end now. We've seen the disease, we've seen her determination. Now look at her deliverance, verses 47 and 48. And when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." I love this here. For people who think Jesus didn't know what was going on, what does she realize? I have not escaped the notice of Jesus. This is called God's drawing of the heart. God's working in her heart. She knows there's no hiding from God. Some of us are afraid to come forward. Some of us are afraid to go public with our faith. What will people think of us? Will people judge us? But Jesus is touchable by even the untouchable. Come forward, testify, pray, tell others. Don't be afraid. I want to even apply this another way. Some of you are so afraid to pray out loud. That's probably sometimes the church's very fault. Sometimes we have very churchy prayers, don't we? Let me tell you something. Prayer is a heart calling out to God. Vocal prayer is a vocal heart crying out to God. Stop worrying about what people think about your prayers because you're not praying to them. If you are, you're not praying. Pray to God. Just speak to Him. That's prayer. That's all it is. It's a heart crying out to God. Public prayer is a heart praying out to God publicly. You don't need to worry about what other people think. You need to pray. You need to pray. Our faith, J.C. Ryle said, could be feeble and weak. It may be small, our courage. And our grasp of the gospel and its promises could be weak and trembling. But the question here is, do we really trust only in Christ? Look to Jesus and only to Jesus. He says, that is the faith that will save our souls. So notice how this passage beautifully ends. Jesus does not frown upon her. He does not correct her. He's not angry with her. He doesn't judge her. He doesn't say, you had no right to touch me. He doesn't say, don't you know you're an outcast? Don't you know that you were coming close to breaking the law? He doesn't say, who do you think you are? He doesn't say, next time ask first. No, no, no. He looks at her with tenderness and affection. He reassures her. And by the way, she's the only woman called daughter directly by Jesus in the whole Bible. He restores her as a daughter of Israel. He speaks to her as a father does to a child. The other Gospels, he says, take courage, be of good comfort. He silences her fears. Don't forget how Luke 8 began with those women who followed Jesus. And now he comforts this woman here and reminds her, don't worry about what anyone else thinks. The King of Kings claims you as family. You are in the best family in the universe. Daughter, your faith has saved you. That's our last point, by the way. Your faith has saved you. Notice, her faith was not a passive faith. It was an active faith. It's not just intellectual. It's life-changing. Something happened because her heart believed. So here's what I want to end with. Faith is often very imperfect. Faith is often laced with impurity, with fear, with trepidation, with ignorance. Faith is not perfect in this world. Faith often has a lot of problems. Today you might say, I've got some faith, but it's not very good. It's not very pretty. It's not very polished. It's not PhD faith. It's not maybe the most sound theological faith. It's not the deepest faith. I feel sometimes like I'm, a mile wide and an inch deep. My faith is struggling. My faith is just a breath away from not being alive. My faith is barely hanging on. Sometimes I struggle with whether I have more faith in the church than I do in the Christ of the church. Sometimes I struggle in my faith whether I really believe every word in the Bible or at least can apply it to my life. Sometimes my faith is really downcast. Like the car, that little odometer, it's on E, and it's been on E for about 10 minutes. Fumes of fumes. Well, I have good news for you. One of the greatest and most assuring truths of the Christian faith is that it is not the strength of your faith that saves you. It is not having perfect faith. It is not having your act all together in your faith. It is not knowing everything in your faith. It is not having the faith of King David or having the faith of the Apostle Paul or something like that. Friends, it is not the strength of your faith that saves you. This woman's faith was weak. She was afraid to talk to Jesus. She was afraid to even approach him from the front. All she was willing to do is just reach out and touch the hem of his garment, just get a tap of it. That was all she was willing to do. And then she was hiding away. She didn't want anyone to know she was even there. That's pretty weak faith. But good news, brothers and sisters, while it is not the strength of your faith that saves you, it is the object and person of your faith that saves you. Thankfully, her faith wasn't very strong, but she was looking to the right person. She had her faith in the right object, the Lord Jesus Christ. God is kind and gentle and accepts imperfect and weak faith as long as it is good faith in Jesus Christ. So what does he say to her? Go in peace. This is the Hebrew word shalom in the Old Testament, irene in the New Testament. This word speaks of wholeness. This speaks of the smile of God. You're a daughter or a son of God. God smiles on you. Go in peace, physically, socially, spiritually. You are recovered. It's the same thing he said to a woman in the last chapter. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. This was the very point of the Gospel of Luke. In Luke 1, the Song of Zechariah said, Jesus is coming to shine on those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death and to direct our feet into the way of peace. This desperate woman represents all of us. Everyone in this room. All of us are sick with sin. Irrecoverable on our own. We are ill. We have disobeyed God. Every one of us here have spent our money and our time on things that did nothing to save us. We have invested our resources, our wallets, our bank accounts, our relationships, and they have all let us down and failed us. Friends, there's only one place that we will find hope, that we will find deliverance, that we will go from being an outcast to a son or a daughter of the King, and that is by putting our entire faith in Jesus Christ. Not perfect faith, pure faith. Reach out to Christ today and be made whole. Your faith has saved you. He will say, go in peace. Let's pray.